Good evening, everyone, and welcome to HARAMBE. Tonight our focus is on this medium, television, because for millions of Americans, television provides the only extended contact with people of a different race. 69% of all Americans recently polled said that television is their principal source of news about what's going on in the world. Synergizing these two dynamics, what effect is television news having on the development of racial perceptions? Is the heavy emphasis on crime news having an even greater impact on racial perceptions and race relations? And more importantly, does TV news imagery impact public policy? We pose these questions to Dr. Robert Entman, Professor of Journalism and Communications at Northwestern University. Professor Entman is recognized as one of the premier scholars in the area of TV news content analysis research. We got the opportunity to talk to this very interesting researcher thanks to the fine people at Kutztown University who have been eager and consistent supporters of Channel 39 and public television for years. And we're going to get to that interview in just a moment. But first, it's time to test your knowledge of history. It's time for our feature, Black Facts. Entman, first of all, I'd like to welcome you to the campus of Kutztown University.
Thank you. It's
good
to be here.
Enjoy your stay.
Absolutely.
Dr. Entman, you recently completed some research which included content analysis of 4 Chicago TV news programs over a 55-day period. Exactly what is content analysis? What methodology did you use, and what were your findings?
Well, content analysis really refers to systematically looking at the media and trying to determine the images that they are providing day in and day out. That's all content analysis is. It means counting carefully, setting up categories, and seeing what's happening in a way that's much more precise than usually where we have, we just sort of notice something and we think something's going on. Content analysis allows you to see what's really going on in that pattern of day in and day out of images. The methods I used were basically to define some categories and compare the portrayals of blacks and whites in similar categories. For example, crime stories, stories about politics. And by looking in detail at how black people were portrayed when they were involved in politics or crime, or allegedly, and white people, how they were portrayed, you can begin to develop a sense of the difference in the images that blacks and whites have in the media. And that was the goal of the research. Now, to summarize my findings, of course I have a lot of findings. Maybe I'll start with the most general kind of sense that I got from this series of analyses. And that is that the media unintentionally, I want to underline that this is not an intentional plot or anything like that, provide a pattern of images that heighten whites' fear, anxiety, and perhaps anger towards blacks as a class. I think that the pattern of images, unfortunately and unintentionally, reinforces certain stereotypes about black people as a group. And if the news practices aren't changed, we have to conclude that news is contributing not to the enlightenment of the public, but really to making worse one of our deepest domestic problems. And it isn't just a domestic problem, it's really a fundamental problem of our society.
What are some of those stereotypes that you assert that the media is kind of feeding into?
Well, let me give you a specific example. One of the things I did was to look very carefully at how they treated blacks versus whites accused of violent crimes. One of the things I found is that blacks were twice as likely to be shown in physical grasp, in physical custody. That is, a police officer was shown holding on to the black accused. This happened twice as much for black defendants as white defendants. Now, to me, if you assume that the audience is watching day in and day out, and it is, I mean, this is a very widely watched program, the local news. It's one of the most popular of all programs, and it's more popular, by the way, than network news. People are getting, unconsciously, subliminally, a message that blacks, when they're accused of a crime, are more dangerous than whites accused of the very same kind of crimes. That blacks are more dangerous, more in need of restraint. And I think that promotes a stereotype that in turn makes whites more fearful, more anxious, and probably more angry toward blacks as a category.
Mm-hmm. Your research also covered political actors, if you will, activists and what have you within the black community. Why don't you expound on that?
If you look at political stories, there are a couple of things that are happening. First of all, television, because of its production values, the kind of medium it is, it will pick out the most dramatic, confrontational, emotional moments of any kind of political story. I like to say that television, while it hates talking heads, loves shouting heads. Now, what that means is that if Jesse Jackson gives an hour-long speech, almost inevitably, television will pick out the 15-second soundbite where his voice is raised and he's saying something angry or emotional. There's, an hour or 59 minutes worth of other stuff that doesn't get on the air. That's not because TV's trying to make Jesse Jackson look bad. It's because TV's trying to make good TV out of that speech. But again, it's a pattern over the years, over and over, of seeing black people seemingly more angry, more emotional. A second pattern I found is that blacks are portrayed as if they are very demanding of special treatment from the government. I looked at white people talking about public policy and black people talking about public policy and found on one statistic that blacks were 10 times more selfish, blacks acting in politics, 10 times more than whites, because blacks explicitly said, I want government to do something for the black community, whereas very rarely did whites say something like that, I want some government to do something for the white community. Now, I think we can agree that in reality, all politicians are trying to protect and defend their constituencies, and it is inaccurate to say blacks are 10 times more demanding and self-seeking than white politicians. So that's another example of a stereotype that feeds whites rejection of black demands and anger. Why all this demandingness?
You suggest in some of your writings that local news contributes to modern racism. Exactly what is modern racism, and how does it relate to your research?
The concept of modern racism came out of some scholars' findings that currently a lot of white people know it is not socially acceptable to voice anti-black sentiments. So if you do a survey and you ask people, do you think blacks are, in the traditional stereotypes, lazy, or not as smart as whites, or any one of the other common stereotypes, many whites know enough not to say yes, even if they believe yes, because it's not socially acceptable. So the idea of modern racism is, well, we know that whites still have negative feelings about blacks, that they might not express them in the same way. So the idea of modern racism is that they now express them in a different way, and it's more in terms of rejection of the common black political agenda, an anxiety, a general sense of fear and hostility towards blacks. That isn't saying blacks are inferior. It's saying, I just don't like blacks, I'm afraid of blacks. And what I found is those very traits of modern racism are reinforced by local news, especially, although also by network news, because of the things we've been talking about, that they, for example, portray blacks, even when they're accused of the same crimes, as more dangerous, as scarier than whites.
I'm going to run some statistics at you that I found in my own reading and research, and I want you to basically respond to it. 54% of all violent crime committed in the U.S. is committed by whites. 2/3 of America's welfare recipients are white and reside in rural areas. The fastest rising rate of illegitimacy is among white women, who also have the highest percentage of cocaine pregnancies. According to the New York Times, the typical crack addict is a 40-year-old white male professional, married and suburban. Now, having recited those statistics to you, how do they jive with some of the images that we see day to day in the news media? And does the media have a responsibility to use visual images and depictions of people when they refer to welfare, crime, illegitimacy, and those types of things that's consistent with how it is in reality?
Yeah, I do think it's an important responsibility that the media actually think about how the pattern of their individual stories add up over time, possibly to convey something that's wrong. Such as, for example, in my study of network news, there were 7 cases where there was a story about welfare. And in 6 of those, they used welfare mothers. In 6 of those, they used black women. Well, as you just recited, the majority of women getting welfare are not black. That is misrepresenting the truth. Now, in each individual case, I assumed that the black woman that they showed really was on welfare, so it wasn't a falsification of that one case. But the pattern over time is a falsification. And the problem with this is that journalists get very nervous if you start saying, deliberately seek out a white welfare person. Deliberately realize that the image you're showing needs to be balanced by some other image, like of a white cocaine addict, because they tend to view that as editorializing, as inserting some kind of political agenda into the news, and they view that with great alarm. But what I want to say is that if their duty is to accuracy, then that's not editorializing. It's editorializing to do what they do. It is putting in a subtle, subliminal message that is political and is misleading. And therefore, their duty is precisely to try to avoid that by, going out and saying, if we're going to do a welfare story, let's find some white welfare people. And if we're going to do a crack story, let's deal with the fact that there are a lot of crack users out there who are suburban. Now, it may not be as easy. There are some real production reasons, right? It's not easy to drive into Scarsdale and find people hanging out on the streets, obviously dealing drugs. It's easy to do that in Harlem, which, by the way, is also near the studios. So there are all these practical reasons that it's harder to balance those images, but that's really not an ethical defense of what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Your research indicates that there is a disproportionate amount of time devoted during newscasts to crime. Do we Americans really want to see so much crime every night on the news, or have we been conditioned by the people who produce news to expect crime news?
If you ask people in polls, do you want to see so much crime and violence on the news, they say overwhelmingly no. If you look at the ratings, you have to conclude that people do watch it. Now, I think your point is very well taken, that it may be they watch it because it's a habit to watch and they haven't been given much of an alternative. If you gave them an alternative, maybe they'd watch that too. We don't know. I would urge that those alternatives be tried out at least, and maybe we'd get some positive results.
Well, you're a scholar. You've been you're a student of the media. At what point in television news history, the very short history, did you notice a change, a measurable change in the percentage of news stories that are about crime?
It's hard to say. Really, the big change in local news was, I think, probably in the late 60s or so, when, for a variety of reasons, they began to see local news as a profit center. It was drawing more of an audience. The habit of reading an afternoon newspaper began going down. People's commutes, they were commuting for longer periods of time. So the local news all of a sudden became kind of a hot topic for the owners of local stations, and they decided, hey, we can make some real money. We can jazz this thing up. And so I suspect it started changing then. We don't have records of this. We don't have tapes. I can't go back and do scholarly research. It all vanished into the ether. So I don't know. I have to guess. But I think the perception that it's gotten worse in the last 10 years is almost certainly true. That during the last 10 years, the competition is heated up, cable is out there competing, and as a result, there is more sensationalism and drama on local news.
Dr. Entman, is there any difference between how network news covers the African American community as opposed to how local news covers African Americans?
Well, network news really is different in some ways from local news. crime, for example, is not as big a deal in the network news, and as a result, some of those scary stereotypes, I think, are reduced. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, we have this welfare mother being shown as black, or the crack dealer being shown as black, I think, disproportionately. So there are problems of that sort. There are other problems in network news, given its nature. One thing I did was to look at which black leaders are mentioned, covered at all, for a whole year on network news. What I found was that the two most frequently mentioned were the former mayor of Washington, Marion Barry, and Supreme Court nominee and Justice Clarence Thomas. Both of them, pretty negative figures for a lot of people. Whereas what I like to say is there are hundreds, literally hundreds of effective, hardworking, honest black mayors. But the only representation for that year, at least, of black mayors that the American public got was Marion Barry. And he is not representative. He is not typical. But he feeds into some pretty nasty stereotypes. The reason he was on there, he was dramatic, he was colorful, he had all kinds of good tape. But unfortunately, that may lead to inaccurate perceptions by especially the white audience.
Mm-hmm. You also did some research on the visual depictions of the poor in our country. Tell us about those findings.
I set out to do some research on how is poverty covered on television news. And I quickly learned that poverty isn't much covered in any direct way, that there was really a visual language, a visual coding for poverty news. And the way it works is you're not told this is a story about poverty except by looking at the visuals. And what you see is, if you see black people hanging around on the street, if you see broken up windows, boarded up doors, if you see cars that are kind of sloppy and wheels missing, there are certain visual codes that tell the public, aha, this is a poverty story. And that's how poverty is covered. It's covered in the symptoms of crime and drugs and gangs and all that. And it's rarely, sometimes, but rarely covered directly with words as a policy issue. And I think it's particularly unfortunate that the tendency is to use actually black people as a symbol of poverty. And, the majority of black people are not below the poverty line. And as I think one of the statistics you mentioned is the majority of welfare recipients, and indeed a majority of the poor, are white.
Dr. Entman, I often think, what must it be like to be a big-name anchor, a big-name black anchor in a news operation in a major urban center, and to have to sit there and articulate the news day in and day out, every day of the week? You touched on some of that in terms of how the whites may react to black anchors in your research. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
This is a real paradox, because I think that having black anchors reading, as most major cities have at least some black anchor people, reading this news that reinforces stereotypes in a way makes those stereotypes even more powerful and damaging, because it sort of denies that they are racist. I mean, after all, it's a black person who's reading this news, who's reporting it. So it puts the black anchor or reporter, it doesn't have to be the anchor, it could be the correspondent, in a kind of difficult bind. There's another element of this which I think is a problem, and that is that on the one hand, showing competent, professional, attractive black people at the anchor desk is a way of combating some of the old racial stereotypes, because it certainly says, hey, this guy's making a lot of money and he's doing a good job. I can no longer sustain my belief that all black people are lazy and incompetent. So that sort of stereotype has to go by the board. On the other hand, that very same image of that authoritative, competent, and very well-to-do black anchor says to a white person who might be tending toward prejudice, what's all this stuff about discrimination? Why all this anger in the political stories? Why all this street crime in the ghetto? If they would just sit down and work hard, they could be earning $600,000 a year just like that anchor, and I'm working my butt off, for $50,000 if I'm lucky. So it's to an extent, blacks can't win, I think, in local news. No matter what sort of they do, if it remains the way it is, they themselves may contribute to this problem we're talking about.
Well, Dr. Entman, right now we have President Clinton is working on a new crime bill. He's working on welfare reform and any number of other issues that touch exactly on some of the things that you've done research on. My question to you is, what effect is local television news imagery having on public policy?
Well, I think it's unfortunate in general, and this is even beyond just the racial problem, that the incredible prevalence of violence, this sense that you get night after night if you watch the local news of a world that's out of control, that any minute some threat, and if it's not a criminal, it's a fire or an explosion or a car crash. This sense of the world is incredibly threatening and out of control, feeds into irresponsible politicians who want to come up with simple solutions like build more jails. I mean, we've been building more jails for 25 years and the crime rate is still unacceptably high. At some point, someone ought to figure out that putting people in jail and building more jails is not the whole answer, even if it's part of the answer. But the politics is set up in part by these superficial impressions from local news, and I would say network news as well. The politics is set up so that all people think about when they say do something about crime, the answer is, well, let's lock up more people for a longer time. So I think it feeds into this yearning. The fears that television news produces feeds into the yearning for simple, quick, cheap answers. And that's very damaging. And I think if you look at Clinton, he knows better than what he's saying. He knows that this crime bill is going to have no effect on the important violent crimes. But politically, he's in a bind.
Do you think the typical image of the welfare mother is going to have an impact on the policy that we get on welfare reform?
Well, certainly surveys have shown over and over that there's a great deal of hostility toward welfare and also misinformation. People think that welfare means black, so that if they have any racist tendencies, they come out in their judgment, and all of which means that I think the politics of welfare reform become very difficult to be rational. There's a lot of irrational fears and resentments that go into these debates, and I don't know how it's going to come out, because if you really do reform the system, you are actually going to have to spend some real money. I think in the long term that would save a lot of money. It would also save a lot of human suffering. But I'm afraid that television news, and arguably even the print news as well, has not prepared the public for a very deep understanding of the welfare problem and what it'll take to solve.
What can we do? What can people do who are concerned about the effects of television news imagery on race perceptions and race relations do?
My view is that I'm pretty sympathetic to the owners and people who run these news stations. They're in a very competitive business. They're under a lot of pressure, and it's very difficult for some ivory tower scholar to come in and say, risk your job, risk your ratings by doing this and that to your news, because they're under this commercial pressure. So my view is we should add some pressures in a new dimension, and that's a political dimension. And I would like to see people of goodwill of all races stand up and start a political movement that would demand change and say that no, this is having a political effect, this is editorializing, it is damaging our ability to solve our problems together as a community, and we're putting some pressure on you to cut it out, and maybe that means you'll have to tell some of those advertisers and ratings people you're going to have to suffer a little on that dimension because we're getting such grief on the political dimension. I really urge people to do something politically about this. As long as our country is so torn by these racial animosities, we are less productive in our own country and in the global competitive market. We waste so much money on putting people in prison, on taking care of city decay because people don't have productive jobs, because the education system doesn't prepare them for advanced employment and so forth. And I think part of the reason is that there is so much resentment between the races. And it's a two-way street, too. I don't want to put all the responsibility here on white people. We need to have black people of goodwill come forward as well. But it should be stressed that whites have we're all in this together. Whites have a very strong self-interest, aside from their ethical and moral principles, in trying to deal with getting the relations between the races on a more positive plane.
And we'd like to thank the good folks at Kutztown once again for making it possible for us to interview Dr. Entman. It is our intent to invite him back again so we can catch up on his latest research. And speaking of which, Dr. Entman is currently working on content analysis of so-called reality programs such as Cops, Hard Copy, Real Stories of the Highway Patrol, and the like. Professor Entman says that his preliminary findings indicate that blacks are rarely shown as heroes in these programs. April 27th will be an historic day for African people and diaspora. That is the date that elections take place in Azania, commonly referred to as the Republic of South Africa. Harambe's associate producer Byron Crudit was on the case once again and has an interview with Randall Robinson, executive director of TransAfrica, the influential lobbying group based in Washington, D.C. Here's an excerpt of what Randall Robinson had to say about these important elections.
What are your feelings on the progress or lack thereof of coalition building between the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party as it stands today?
Well, they're political parties, and the ANC is busy running in an election. I think there will be an attempt at peacemaking and coalition building perhaps after the election has run its course. One has to be careful about characterizing the problems of South Africa as Zulus against Xhosas or Inkatha against the ANC. We've got to remember that the majority of Zulus who live in KwaZulu are for the ANC. And so Mr. Buthelezi does not want to run in the election because he would lose it in his own province, in his own homeland. He would lose the election because the majority of his own people wouldn't support him, but would support the African National Congress. So most of the fighting that's going on is between Zulus because Mr. Buthelezi is doing everything he can to disrupt this election process. I don't think it's going to work. I think the elections will go ahead. I think the results will be recognized globally. There are observers there from around the world. And I think in the last analysis, Mr. Buthelezi will listen to reason, hopefully, and I think Mr. Mandela will continue to extend an olive branch and continue to negotiate, and continue to try to find ways to peace. The efforts to be made beyond the election are more formidable. The challenge is more formidable than the challenge getting to this point. South Africa has 50% unemployment. 7 million of 28 million blacks live in self-erected shacks. It's coming out of a worse recession it's suffered in 8 decades. It's an economy mired in difficulties. So many of the young black kids have been out of school for a generation in this political struggle. The school system has been spending virtually nothing on black education. Illiteracy has spiraled. It's an awful situation. These things have to be addressed. It's not enough to produce an ANC-led government. That government has to deliver, and the point is it will need resources to do that. Where's that money going to come from? It's got to come from here. There's not enough money in the South African economy to address these systemic, major infrastructural problems. And so we will have to take the fight to the Clinton administration to make sure that we are, as a nation, as supportive of democracy in South Africa as we have been in Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe.